Who supports free speech anyway? When you look at the history of free speech, it hasn't really been a thing in many places for very long, and even in places where free speech has existed, well, let's just say it's faced constant challenges. Galileo went on trial back in 1633. He said that the Earth revolves around the sun rather than the sun around the Earth. He was put under house arrest for the rest of his life, and his book, Dialogue, that was banned for over 200 years. He had actually been dead for 193 years by the time the Catholic Church actually lifted the ban on his book. Now, I think we can all agree what the church did was bad, right? They shouldn't have done that. Now, if we were going to condemn the church of the time for doing that, what criticism would we lodge against them, right? What specific thing would we say, well, this is why what you did was wrong? One thing we could say is that what they did was wrong because they were incorrect about the relationship of the sun and the earth. But instead of that, we could say what they did was wrong because they chose to silence someone who they disagreed with. And the fact that they were incorrect doesn't matter as much. Now, if we go with the first option and we condemn them simply for being incorrect, then we pretty much need to condemn everyone. In the time, you might have a small family living in a shack, and their entire existence is just trying to get enough food to last through the winter, and they may have also believed the same things about the sun and the earth that the Catholic Church did. But they didn't put Galileo under house arrest and censor his book for over 190 years past his death. Do they really deserve the same condemnation as the Catholic Church? After all, look at your own life. The stuff you think now, did you think the exact same things 1 year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago? You were wrong about at least some things back then. Does that mean that you deserve the same condemnation as the Catholic Church for what they did to Galileo? No, the Church deserves our condemnation not because they believed what they believed. They deserve our condemnation because they believed it with such a surety. They believed it with such conviction that they thought it would be acceptable to put a man under house arrest for the rest of his life because he spoke something different. Reality check, everyone has been wrong, and pretty much everyone will continue to be wrong on at least, some things through their entire life. You can take a look back and see how wrong you used to be about some things, and if you're paying attention, it should be obvious. If you were to go forward in your life 5, 10, 15 years, eventually you'll look back at what you think now, and you will start to see some fault in it. This is why if you take what you believe and you use it as a standard, and you try and, take people outside of the standard and censor them, infringe on their free speech, ultimately, you will, whether you like it or not, you will censor people who are trying to speak the truth, and you will also censor people who are trying to speak out against any falsehoods that exist in your standard. Now, have you heard of Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes? People are paraphrasing him when they say, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. That's not exactly what he said, but he said something like that. Well, let's also take a look at something he also said, and I'll break it down as we go. He said, quote, "Persecution for the expression of opinions seems to me perfectly logical. If you have no doubt of your premises or your power, and you want a certain result with all your heart, you naturally express your wishes in law and sweep away all opposition." So what he's saying there is, when you really, really believe something and you know it's true even with your heart, it's perfectly natural. People do it all the time where they try and silence those who are speaking out against them or speaking out against their ideas, proposing alternatives. When you believe it that bad, that's just something that comes to people naturally. But then he goes on. But when men have realized that time has upset many fighting faiths, they come to believe more than they believe in the very foundation of their own conduct that the ultimate good desired is better reached by free trade in ideas. The best test of truth is the power of thought to get itself accepted in the competition in the market, and that truth is the only ground upon which their wishes safely can be carried out. So now what is he saying here? He's saying time has upset many fighting faiths, which means, just as we talked about a second ago, as you go forward in your life, you will look back and see things and no longer agree with what you believed, even certain things that you really thought were important. Now, maybe sometimes you'll have a complete 180 on your view, and other times it's just, okay, well, I didn't have it completely right back then. Some changes are small, some changes are big, but the point is time upsets your fighting faiths. So, he's saying that what is good is a free trade of ideas, allowing people to express their ideas freely, creates a competition of the market where people are talking directly to each other, people are debating each other, and it allows us to more accurately gauge ideas as we see them directly confronted honestly with different views, different facts, different ideas. And as your life goes on, you often come to the conclusion, just as he has, that system of the free trade of ideas, that competition in the market, is something you end up believing in more than your own ideas, right? Of course, you still believe in your own ideas. You just don't believe in them as much as the idea of free speech itself, right? You think your own ideas are good, but they're not infallible. But you know that the free competition of ideas produces a lot of good things. So what's the deal with trying to prevent someone from speaking? The people in power, ultimately, are deciding that an idea is forbidden. If you think something they don't like, and you're allowed to discuss it with others, that idea might spread, and that's what they don't want. When attacking free speech, they're not attacking speech itself, really. They're not concerned if people go and talk about the weather to each other. They're attacking specific speech because specific speech means that there's an underlying idea in it. Now, some of these people would probably like to police what directly happens in your own head, but they can't do that, at least not yet. So right now they have to settle for outlawing an idea by proxy, and the proxy is speech. Once you've said something specific that indicates that you have a forbidden idea in your head, now they can legally go after you. They say they're going after you for your speech, your hate speech or whatever they want to call it. But in reality, it's because of the idea in your head when you say it. It's thought crime, ultimately. After all, let's just look at what kind of speech is under attack. Are they trying to attack polite speech? Are they trying to make hate speech laws or whatever so we can't wish our neighbor good morning? Or how about politically popular speech? Are they attacking speech where you support current mainstream political trends? Well, obviously not. You've never heard of anyone being punished for speech for saying good morning or loving their neighbor and saying nice things. People don't get punished for saying, my government's doing a good job and the people in power sure are swell. It's never under attack. You always get to say those things. Even when you go to countries where there is no protection for speech, right? You still get to tell your neighbor good morning, that their son's new haircut looks handsome, and that the people in political power are good guys. You get to say all those things. You always do. When we try and look at what speech is actually attacked, we find impolite speech. Things that you could say to other people that might be considered rude, and politically unpopular speech, like when you voice dissonant ideas against the mainstream political trends. Now that's what free speech is about. If you tell your neighbor their son is a liar or a piece of scum, they might get really angry about that. And that anger is why they try and get you silenced. This is why when you tell them good morning, it's not a big deal. If you say politicians are traitors, they might try and silence you. You're speaking out against them. They don't try and silence you when you're saying they're real swell guys. If you say the entire government system needs to be replaced with something better, and you have your own ideas about democracy, republics, monarchism, whatever, if you say a French-style revolution is what needs to be required, that's when they'll try and silence you. Now, maybe that is what's needed, but the entire point of free speech laws is to protect you so you're allowed to say what people don't like you saying, right? That's the point of free speech laws. No one ever is attacking you for the things that they like you saying. They're only attacking you for the things that they don't like you saying. This is why if you hear someone say, I support free speech, but not hate speech, they don't like that rude or offensive speech. They say, I support free speech, but not speech for advocating that particular political system or that political idea. They're saying they don't like free speech. Free speech laws are all about protecting speech from those people. Free speech is about being able to say and think the things that other people don't like it when you say and think. But really, there are a couple types of free speech supporters. You have your technical free speech supporters. They say the government shouldn't be able to lock you up for speaking your mind, and that's a good start. But they may be fine with you losing your voice online, having all your accounts deleted. They say, hey, that's a company. They should be able to choose not to associate with you. This is how people have their accounts deleted. This is how people have their bank accounts shut down for saying things online. People are getting fired from their jobs for saying things. Think about this. Your grocery store is a company. Gas stations are companies. If they cut you off, you'd be screwed. Imagine if you couldn't go to the bank. You couldn't get a job. The grocery store wouldn't sell you food. No gas at the gas station. Are you really in a better situation than if the government jailed you? If you're afraid that speaking your mind means that you won't get to eat, do you really have free speech? Well, no, not really. This is why there's another type of free speech supporter, a cultural free speech supporter. They don't just view free speech as a law that prevents government persecution. They think we should have a robust culture that protects free speech. While they might be okay if, someone decides not to be your friend if you say something rude to them, they don't want you to be unable to find work, unable to buy food if you say the wrong thing. They don't want you shoved out of the public discourse by companies like Google on YouTube and Facebook, or to be prevented from buying gasoline for your car just because your opinions are rude or politically dissident. If all the banks and landlords in your town tried to make sure you couldn't get a roof over your own head because you voiced an unpopular opinion, cultural free speech supporters would stand with you. They'd say, I might not agree with this person, but we can't deny them the basics, food, clothes, a roof over their head, the ability to work for a living, just because they speak something that we don't like. Their support for free speech is not just a mundane technicality. They have a robust view of us all being able to speak our minds without starving to death in the gutter because you've been shut out of everything. So don't be a technical free speech supporter, be a robust cultural free speech supporter. When you hear someone online maybe saying something and they get their bank accounts shut down, you need to speak out against that. That's wrong. When people are removed from YouTube, Facebook, for talking about the wrong ideas, even in private Facebook groups, you need to fight that. People should be able to speak to each other. The public square used to be a common space in the center of communities, an actual physical space, a square often, where people could go together and they'd exchange ideas and they'd plan things. Facebook, YouTube, these services were created as digital public squares for the digital age we live in. This is where modern discourse and the public sharing of ideas is happening. And these services advertised themselves basically as a public square when they were released. If someone supports being chased out of a public square for sharing the wrong view, they're not a cultural free speech supporter. If they support YouTube changing their algorithms to hide the speech they don't like, they're not really a free speech supporter, at least not culturally, not meaningfully. Now, in this video, I was going to talk about PewDiePie's donation to the ADL, but ultimately he rescinded that donation. If you don't know about the ADL, they've existed for over 100 years. Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith is what they started at. They're a pro-Jewish organization, but more importantly than that, for the last couple decades, they've had a big project on internet censorship. Here's this article from J Weekly. This is a Jewish news organization. 1998, the ADL had created a hate filter software to block computer users from being able to access information that the ADL is not a fan of, access ideas they don't like. They were pushing for this to be put on computers in libraries and stuff. Remember, this was the late 90s. Not a lot of people had personal computers in their home, and internet connections were very expensive. So when you needed to find information online or you wanted to expose yourself to new ideas online, a lot of people were going to libraries. And the ADL was pretty keen on making sure that people couldn't access information they didn't like. And look at YouTube back in 2005 when it was first started up, before it was bought by Google. A lot of people who started on YouTube really believed in the idea of a marketplace of ideas, where ideas come to battle it out, just like how Oliver Holmes talked about. The sort of philosophy was, hey, if we all discuss the pros and cons of things openly, if we let the strengths and weaknesses of these different ideas sort of shine through the mist, we'll all become at least slightly more enlightened. Back then, videos had video responses. So you'd see a video that someone would be expressing an idea, an opinion, and right underneath the video, you'd see the responses. People would have their own videos. They'd say, hey, I think you were right about this, but I think your conclusion is wrong, or I think you misrepresented data here. Blah, blah, blah. It's kind of like how YouTube currently puts those little information boxes under certain videos, but instead of YouTube deciding what you need to believe, it was an organic system, right, of people just talking to each other. Now, it wasn't a perfect system. That system ultimately ended up getting heavily abused for spam and advertisements, and then I think once it became this sort of spam advertisement thing, people stopped paying attention to video responses because, after all, they were nearly all spam, and YouTube chose to just remove them outright rather than try and, revamp the system or prevent the spam. But while it existed early on, it did accomplish something in helping facilitate that marketplace of ideas. But let's flash forward to today. YouTube removes channels because the creator has forbidden ideas. YouTube prevents videos from getting views and remove them from search features and changes how they are showed in the algorithm because of the types of speech they don't like. Social media companies have worked together to try and remove people from the internet. You remember Alex Jones' thing? And they've also worked with organizations like the ADL to get people punished. I mean, people's bank accounts are getting shut down, people's PayPal accounts. It's essentially trying to ruin people's lives. Let's look at the new hate speech policy YouTube has implemented. It says you can't do all sorts of things, everything from advocating assault against a person to comparing a person, an individual, to an animal. Now, I understand this might sound reasonable at first. They specifically wrote this to sound as reasonable as possible. I mean, after all, how could you compare someone to an animal or a disease or an insect? But look at this. How many videos, when talking about modern issues, might compare someone to an animal? What if they accuse someone of being a weasel? Have you ever heard that? Calling someone a weasel is a very common thing. It's more information than just saying that someone's a liar or disingenuous. A weasel is someone who often skirts the edge of truth and uses a sort of plausible deniability to get away with it. Or they often make lots of excuses for the misrepresentations that they use. We also call people chickens for being cowards. We call people catty if they're spiteful. We call people donkeys if they're stubborn. Foxes are sly people. A mouse is a shy person, but a rat is a traitorous person. Wake up, sheeple! Sheep are followers. They're conformist. Leeches are people who live off of other people. These things are actually not that bad. I know it sounds bad, right? When they write that rule, I say, well, you can't compare a person to an animal or a disease or an insect. But that's part of our normal speech. It happens all the time. YouTube's rules also say you can't deny a well-documented violent event that took place. You can't call something a false flag. That being said, false flags do happen, don't they? We know they have. And sometimes false flags are widely accepted as truth when they happen. And they don't tell us if we can disagree with part of the mainstream narrative of an event. Can that get you banned? Well, they don't tell us. When you look at these rules, you get an impression. These are incredibly broad rules. Now, why do they make their rules so broad? If a person that YouTube happens to like, and they share ideas that YouTube likes, in that video, if they call someone a weasel or a chicken, are they going to get banned or have their videos removed? Well, not likely. That's just part of normal, everyday, happens all the time speech. The reason you make rules this broad is so when someone you don't like makes a video, they run afoul of a rule really quick, right? Because we're outlining or we're making against the rule just basic everyday speech, anyone who disagrees with you is going to break a rule really quick. And then that's your excuse to remove their video, give them content strikes, or just delete their YouTube channel. These rules are made to punish people who have wrong thoughts, thought criminals. And as cultural free speech supporters, we can't stand for this. But these rules about hate speech aren't the only thought crimes out there today. Imagine if there's a person, a bad person, that person were to beat up your sister or your mother for no reason. Random attack on the street. Obviously, be a real scumbag move to physically beat up your family member. But if someone else also beat up my mom or sister, and it turns out they did it because they disliked women during the attack, the attacker said something like women are scum, what would that mean? The guy who beat up your sister or mother might go to jail for 5 years. And the guy who beat up my sister or mother goes to jail for 10 because it got called a hate crime. Now the question is, what's the correct amount of time for putting someone away when they beat up a woman? Is 5 years the correct amount of time? If 5 years is the correct amount of time, then my guy is going to be stuck in jail for years past his due. If 10 years is the correct amount of time for assaulting a person like that, then your case is an injustice. Your guy's getting away with less than what should be punished. So think about it. If my guy gets double the punishment than your guy, what is he getting punished for? Those extra years, what are they coming from? They're coming from the ideas in his head. The legal system believes he had bad thoughts, and they'll legally punish him. Reality is, hate crimes are thought crimes. Back in 1996, the Church Arson Prevention Act was passed. Now, this act was called an Arson Prevention Act, but it doesn't, for example, mandate that churches be fireproof or something to prevent arson. But what it does do is imposes additional penalties on people if they commit arson on a religious building because they don't like people who go there, right? It's a certain race of people. Now, arson is already illegal before the act was passed, of course. You might think, if we really need more punishment for arson, why don't we just increase the punishment for arson across the board? Why are we doing this thing where we're attempting to find out the contents of the criminal's head to see if there was forbidden thoughts before we can give them the time that we think they need? And ultimately, this is the nature of hate crime laws. If you're young, you might think the idea of having hate crime laws is normal, but before the 1980s, the idea of hate crime laws was kind of unknown to the public. Think about it historically. If you were in the Middle Ages in Europe, if someone killed a family member of yours, the authorities would try and catch that criminal and put him to death for killing your family member. It doesn't matter if they hated your family member because they were a woman, or if they hated your family member because they had said something rude. A murderer is a murderer. A criminal is a criminal. You punish criminals for the crimes they commit. You don't punish criminals for the fact that they have their own opinions on things. And while some hate crime laws are written as laws that put extra punishment on criminals for committing a crime because of race in general, or other things like that, some hate crime laws are only set up with certain quote-unquote protected groups. Those laws might mean that beating a black guy for being black incurs additional penalties, while beating a white guy for being white is normal. We're only criminalizing certain thoughts with those types of laws. And we can actually see that same sort of thing happening with YouTube's hate speech policy video. They say, quote, "We remove content promoting violence or hatred against members of protected groups." If you're getting hate not associated with a protected group, well, then I guess you deserve that hate. So as I mentioned before, the 1980s, the idea of hate crime laws weren't really known in the public. The 1996 Church Arson Prevention Act, which was in part drafted by the ADL, was kind of a new wave of laws. Before, like the mid-90s, hate crime laws just really didn't start to see much in the way of political movement. In fact, I'm sure the ADL would be very proud to tell you that the USA probably wouldn't have much in the way of hate crime laws if it wasn't for organizations like them, the ADL, also the SPLC, Southern Poverty Law Center, and the American Jewish Committee. Without them, we probably wouldn't have many of these laws with protected groups. All these laws trying to figure out what kind of punishment to dole out to criminals based off of what they're thinking might not exist. Instead, we would just start handing out harsher penalties for criminals if we thought that the crimes needed harsher penalties for the things that they're actually doing. We likely wouldn't have these thought crime laws without them. Now, here's something I want you to think about. What if you, by accident or in self-defense, hurt someone? And when you went to court, there were charges of hate crime brought against you. And that prosecutor, in attempting to argue that you thought forbidden thoughts, that you had illegal ideas, reaches out to YouTube or Google to try and get your search history. They try and figure out what books you've read. They say, look, this person read a racist thing online. This person follows someone on Twitter who said a bad thing. Even if you didn't agree with it, or even if you didn't see it, don't be surprised if eventually we see a United States or a world where exposing yourself to an idea, even one you disagree with, could get you in hot water and get you labeled as a hater, a hate criminal, or a thought criminal. Oppose these hate crime laws, these thought crime laws, and be a cultural free speech supporter.